I asked you whether or not you are the head of a mafia organization in the Tampa, Florida area.
I refuse to answer that question on the grounds that the answer may tend to incriminate me in violation of my constitutional rights.
Are you, Mr. Trafficante, a member of what is known as the mafia, either here or in any other state or city in the United States?
Mr. Chairman, we can't continue under these conditions, in this atmosphere.
Santo Trafficante Sr. was fiercely protective of his empire, running his businesses with an iron fist. He was a slippery figure, hard to pin down, always one step ahead of the law and his rivals. Luciano was right when he said Lansky and Trafficante were like oil and water. They never mixed. And Lansky, sharp as ever, knew better than to ever cross paths with Santo Trafficante Sr. as well as Jr. Santo Trafficante was a man who thrived in shadows. Unlike his fellow mobsters, especially men like Meyer Lansky, Charlie Luciano, Joe Adonis, Willie Moretti, Frank Costello and Jimmy Blue Eyes, you'd never spot Santo Trafficante Sr. or his son Jr. lounging by the poolside at the Hotel Nacional or strutting through the buzzing streets of Havana. With Junior's green eyes glinting behind wire-rimmed glasses, this Tampa, Florida mafioso was often mistaken for a mild-mannered banker or a soft-spoken college professor. But anyone from the Italian neighborhoods of Tampa knew better. If someone whispered, "If you don't toe the line, the man with the green eyes will come for you," it wasn't a warning. It was a death sentence. Trafficante wasn't just ruthless. He was practically a force of nature, hiding lethal power behind an ordinary facade. Though younger than most of the heavyweights in the Italian-Mafia, Corsican Mafia and the Cuban mob, Trafficante's influence was staggering. His ties to Cuba were deep, stretching back to when he was the youngest attendee at the infamous 1946 mob summit at the Nacional Hotel. While he may not have owned Cuban dictator Batista like Lansky did, Trafficante had something just as valuable: fluency in Spanish and an intimate knowledge of Cuban culture. And as the mafia carved Havana into its playground, Trafficante swiftly rose to the top, second only to Lansky himself. But here lay the rub. From the outset, his relationship with Lansky was a toxic cocktail of jealousy, suspicion, and territorial rivalry. The tension simmered just beneath the surface, waiting to explode. Trafficante's resentment was personal. His father, Santo Trafficante Sr., had meticulously built a mafia empire in Cuba long before Lansky ever set foot on the island. Havana was supposed to be their dominion. Then Lansky appeared, upending the Trafficante legacy like a thief in the night. Frank Regano, Trafficante's longtime lawyer, once asked him about Lansky. Santo's voice practically hissed with venom. "That dirty Jew bastard," he spat. "Don't trust him for a second. My father dealt with him. He's poison." The feud wasn't just professional. It was personal. And it stretched back further than most people knew. Trafficante's connection to Cuba wasn't just through his business dealings. His ties to the island ran through the very streets of Tampa, the Gulf Coast city that had been a hotbed of Cuban immigration since the 1890s. Ybor City, once an independent enclave, became a political hub for Cuban exiles fighting for independence from Spain. In its cafes, revolutionaries planned, fundraised, and shipped arms to the freedom fighters or mambises across the water. This was where revolutionaries like José Martí sought refuge, and where in 1893 he narrowly escaped an assassination plot. 2 Spanish agents had tried to poison him only for the scheme to backfire spectacularly. Martí, ever the saint, saved them from a mob's wrath and even forgave them. In an ironic twist, the 2 would-be assassins joined Martí's cause and died beside him 2 years later in Cuba. Tampa was no stranger to revolution, and neither was Trafficante. But while the cigar factories buzzed with talk of freedom, another pastime gripped the immigrant community: bolita, a simple but addictive game of chance. For as little as a nickel or a dime, players would bet on which numbered ball would be drawn last from a sack. The odds were long, but the payoff, a staggering 90-1, kept everyone in the game. Every day, the small-time bets piled into a massive pot, and in the shadows, the Trafficantes thrived. Bolita wasn't just a game, it was a way of life. And for Trafficante, it was the foundation of an empire that would stretch all the way from Tampa to the heart of Havana's criminal underworld. For generations, bolita had been the lifeblood of Cuban gambling, an addictive game that had crossed the sea to Florida, thanks to a notorious kingpin named Manuel El Gallego Suarez. In Tampa, this simple game of chance grew into the beating heart of an entire criminal empire. Blood was spilled in brutal gang wars for control of the racket, and by the 1920s, one man emerged victorious from the carnage: Santo Trafficante Sr., a cunning, ruthless mafioso who would turn bolita into his personal kingdom. But it wasn't just gambling profits fueling his empire. The elder Trafficante was shrewd enough to see bolita as the perfect front for even darker ventures. Using the money from the game, he built a bolita-funded bank that would support his ventures in rum running during Prohibition. It was through these smuggling operations that Trafficante first crossed paths with two names destined to become legends of organized crime: Meyer Lansky and Charles "Lucky" Luciano. Together they orchestrated daring runs of rum and molasses from Cuba to the US, dodging law enforcement while amassing fortunes. But when Prohibition ended in 1933, Trafficante didn't skip a beat. He shifted his focus to the narcotics trade. With the extensive network he'd built through bolita and rum smuggling, he expanded into Havana, cementing key alliances. Among his powerful Cuban partners were Indalecio Pertierra, an influential congressman with deep connections, and Senator Paco Prio, brother to the future president of Cuba. These relationships opened doors that few others could access. In 1945, these alliances gave birth to a sinister innovation: Aerovías Q, a shadowy airline that operated out of military airports. The Mafia didn't just have an airline, they had one that bypassed local customs altogether. It became a clandestine superhighway for drug trafficking. According to Cuban author Enrique Cirules, Aerovías Q made weekly flights to Camagüey and Medellin, notorious hubs for cocaine production. The cartel in Medellin had a powerful laboratory churning out product destined for Santo Trafficante Sr. The drugs didn't always go straight to Havana. Instead, they were often diverted through Camagüey, where local political figures and pharmaceutical connections ensured safe passage. The underworld was shifting, evolving into something far more dangerous and intertwined than ever before. The birth of a new and old powerful link between global narcotics traffickers, notorious gangsters, and ruthless drug dealers was on the horizon. But this time, there was a darker undercurrent, one that reached into the shadows of intelligence agencies and military circles. Whether driven by the allure of unimaginable wealth or the secret funding of private wars, perhaps both. This sinister alliance found itself backed by a cadre of unlikely partners. The world of organized crime had come out of the chaos of the Second World War stronger than ever, with new international ties that stretched from the gritty streets of New Orleans to the sun-drenched shores of Florida. At the heart of this burgeoning network was the powerful crime boss Santo Trafficante Sr., whose deep connections with the legendary Silver Dollar Sam had been forged over years of dirty dealings. When Carlos Marcello rose to power, taking the reins of the New Orleans crime family, he made it clear that he didn't want the traditional, brutal, mafia-style killings happening on Louisiana soil. He knew they attracted far too much heat. In Florida, though, things were different. Men disappeared on fishing trips or private flights their bodies never recovered, with their deaths dismissed as tragic accidents. Carlos Marcello relied heavily on the Florida as well as Sicilian mafia to carry out hits for him, or in Florida's territory other states also were in play, as both men pretty much ruled over the South, this skillfully avoiding any direct blowback on his own operations. The ties between the Marcello Empire and the Florida underworld, led by Santo Trafficante Jr. during the start of the 50s, grew stronger by the day. Carlos Marcello, though born in Tunisia, shared Luciano's distaste for the deep-rooted Sicilian traditions of the mafia, especially those that were still firmly entrenched in Louisiana and other parts of the South. Marcello's rise to power was nothing short of revolutionary. He reshaped the criminal underworld in Louisiana to fit his own vision, breaking free from the old Sicilian ways, and in doing so became a powerhouse in his own right. But despite his success, Marcello, much like Trafficante, harbored a deep mistrust for Lansky and his associates, and anti-Semitism ran through both men's veins. They never fully trusted Lansky or the Jewish mobsters, no matter how powerful they were. The New Orleans and Florida crime families were notoriously secretive, making it nearly impossible to become a made man or a captain unless you were a blood relative. To be part of these crime families, you had to be born into them or related through blood or marriage. There were no other ways in. This exclusivity is why you rarely hear about formal initiations or ceremonies. Most of the men involved were born into the syndicate, making the organization more insular and tight-knit than others. These two southern crime lords, Marcello and Trafficante, were like two towering titans, bound by a mutual respect and fear of each other's deadly capabilities. For decades, from the late 40s, 50s, 60s through the 80s, they ruled their respective domains with iron fists. Trafficante's seniors as well as juniors' route go back to the days of Silver Dollar Sam, also extended to Junior's ties with Anthony Carollo, the son of the old and real New Orleans boss Silver Dollar Sam. Together, they formed an unbreakable alliance, until the unpredictable force of Carlos Marcello changed everything. He was destined to rise to the top, not through brute force alone, but by harnessing strategic alliances, including those with the Jewish mafia, despite his deep-seated anti-Semitism. His relationship with the Jewish mobsters was crucial to his anointing as the rightful boss of New Orleans by none other than Luciano, Frank Costello, and other mafia power brokers of the time, including Chicago. The ambitions of Marcello and Trafficante extended beyond their own borders. Both men dreamed of taking control of Cuba, a paradise that beckoned with untapped potential. But Meyer Lansky and Lucky Luciano had other plans. Lansky, ever the master strategist, wasn't about to let two southern bosses claim his prize. With a ruthless efficiency, Lansky's men, led by the notorious Jimmy Blue Eyes, began seizing control of Cuba's lucrative casinos. Lansky, who had long coveted total dominance of Cuba's gambling operations, was quick to eliminate the smaller players standing in his way. Before long, every casino in Havana knew the score. Lansky was slowly becoming the undisputed king of Cuba's gambling empire, and he was going to share the spoils with men who were heavily loyal to him. The battle for Cuba was only beginning, but one thing was clear. The stakes had never been higher, and the alliances forged in the shadows were more fragile than ever. But then, everything changed. In late 1946, the arrival of Charlie Luciano in Havana upended Trafficante Sr.'s reign. The allure of Luciano's New York syndicate, bolstered by Meyer Lansky, proved too tempting for Trafficante's Cuban allies. Pertiera and Prio jumped ship, abandoning Trafficante to align with the more powerful Luciano-Lansky duo. It was a betrayal that would fester like a wound within the Trafficante family for years to come, particularly for Santo Jr., who inherited his father's bitter grudge against Lansky. By 1950, the elder Trafficante, ailing and weakened, had stepped back from the criminal stage. His son, Santo Trafficante Jr., wasted no time in taking full control of the Bolita empire, which continued to thrive in Tampa's Ybor City. Business was booming, so much so that it caught the eye of the Kefauver Committee, the government's aggressive anti-crime investigation. In December 1950, the committee descended upon Tampa's county courthouse, looking to expose the dark underworld of organized crime. Somehow, the Trafficante crime family dodged the subpoena, but not everyone was so lucky. Charlie Wall, a grizzled old rival in the bolita game, was called to testify. Wall, who had faced countless assassination attempts from the Trafficantes over the years and had somehow survived them all, was now a frail man of 71. After a storied life of crime, he retired from the bolita business and relocated to Miami, where he partnered with Lansky in ventures like dog and horse racing. Hard of hearing but still sharp-tongued, Wall took the stand in front of the Kefauver Committee and delivered a theatrical performance that captivated everyone in the room. Charlie Wall's testimony before the Kefauver Committee was electric. He didn't need to drop names. His words painted a target so clearly that everyone in the room could feel the weight of what he wasn't saying. He described in chilling detail several assassinations attempt on his life, one of which many believed had Santo Trafficante Jr.'s signature all over it. Wall leaned forward, his voice steady but carrying the weight of years of close calls. "The first time it happened, I was stepping out of my garage," he began. The committee member's voice cut in, sharp and probing. "Were you alone?" Wall shook his head. "No, my wife was with me. She was a little ahead, heading to the front gate. Then, out of nowhere, this car pulls up, slow, like they wanted to be sure they didn't miss their mark." "And that's when they opened fire?" the committee member pressed, tension thick in the room. "Yeah." Wall's voice dropped, the memory still sharp. "The guy starts shooting. At first I didn't even realize they were aiming for me. You don't know what's going on until it hits you." "You were hit?" the committee member asked, leaning closer. "Yeah, right in the back. But it didn't go deep. More like a graze, you know. Like they say, it glimpsed me." "Glimpsed you?" The committee member raised an eyebrow, clarifying. "You mean it barely missed?" Wall nodded, his eyes distant. "Exactly. Before I could even hit the ground, someone else fired a shotgun. Boom. I felt the blast, but I was already down. Buckshot flew right over me. Too close, but it didn't hit. And the attackers," the committee member pushed, the room hanging on every word. "They were gone in seconds, sped off like they knew exactly what they were doing." "And me?" Wall chuckled darkly. "Hell, I was so scared I started shooting back. Don't even remember pulling out a gun, but I had one. Must have fired a few shots at them, then ran back inside." Wall's words hung in the air like a noose tightening around the unspoken culprits. The committee member asked were on edge, the entire courtroom straining to catch every word as Wall recounted his near-death experience with a calmness that made it even more unsettling. And yet, while Wall's testimony riveted the committee, it sent shockwaves through the Tampa underworld. He hadn't named the Trafficantes, but his veiled accusations were enough to shake the criminal hierarchy. It felt like only a matter of time before the old man would pay the ultimate price for his loose lips. But in a twist of fate, Wall struck first. By mid-1952, the aging gangster started moving, as if he was itching for a comeback in the bolita racket. As if the old warhorse wasn't ready to ride quietly into the night. What followed was a bloody string of tit-for-tat murders, as mobsters in and around Tampa started dropping like flies, a throwback to the blood-soaked days of the bolita wars. Then came the pivotal moment. On the evening of January 2nd, 1953, Santo Trafficante Jr. and his wife had just stepped out of their home in Ybor City, sliding into the front seat of his sleek 1951 Mercury. Santo barely had time to notice the car creeping up when, boom, a 12-gauge shotgun blast tore through the air, buckshot shredding his arm. Another shot followed, slamming into the car just above the rear window, missing Santo and his wife by a mere inch. The gunman fled into the night. The attack was eerily similar to the one Charlie Wall had described to the Kefauver Committee. The same buckshot, the same setup, with Trafficante's wife by his side. The next morning, the Tampa Tribune blared its headlines with the kind of story that seemed ripped straight from a Hollywood crime thriller. Once again, the streets of Tampa echoed with the deafening roar of gunfire, and at the center of it all was none other than Santo Trafficante Jr., a man whose name was whispered in both fear and respect throughout the city's shadowy underworld. This wasn't just another incident. This was a brazen attack on one of the most notorious figures in Florida's bolita gambling empire. As he rode through Ybor City, the heart of Tampa's underworld, 3 blasts of buckshot exploded from the darkness, targeting Trafficante himself. Though wounded, he escaped with only a slight injury to his right arm. The man whose very presence once caused rooms to fall silent now found himself dodging bullets in the very streets he once controlled. Trafficante wasn't just any underworld figure. He was the elusive missing witness in the high-profile Kefauver Senate Crime Committee hearings. For years, his name had dominated the scene, synonymous with bolita, the infamous numbers game that had a stranglehold on Tampa. The shooting, it seemed, was no mere random act of violence. It came on the eve of rumors swirling that the entire bolita operation in Tampa was about to be shut down for good. Word on the street was that the plug was about to be pulled on the lucrative game, permanently. And while tongues wagged in the underworld, the man himself remained tight-lipped, offering no theories or explanations. When reached for comment by the Tribune, Trafficante dismissed the attempt on his life with casual indifference. It was nothing at all, he said, as if he hadn't just stared death in the face. When pressed, "It didn't even nick you." He coolly replied, "No." But behind the calm demeanor was a man who had survived more than his share of close calls. Just weeks prior, Trafficante had been under investigation for the grisly shotgun murders of 2 gamblers, René Nunez and Angelo Giglio, found face down with slugs buried deep in their backs on September 22nd. The case remained unsolved, stalled by a leadership change at the sheriff's office. Was this attack retaliation? A warning? A move in the ongoing war for control of Tampa's gambling rackets? The Tribune's phones rang off the hook with tips, 2 of which came from anonymous callers, who hung up as quickly as they dialed. The police pieced together what they could in the aftermath. 2.5 hours after the shots rang out, they released a preliminary account of events. It appeared Trafficante had enjoyed a quiet dinner with his wife and their 9-year-old daughter at the home of his father-in-law, Antonino Marchese, located at 2009 10th Avenue. At around 7:25 that evening, Trafficante left the house alone, stepping into a 1951 Mercury registered to Frank Ferreri, a close associate. He had barely driven 25 feet down the road when a car approached from the west. Then the boom of a shotgun ripped through the air. In an instant, Trafficante ducked, reaching for the door handle as a slug tore into his arm. He spilled out of the car, rolling onto the ground just as his wife and child rushed out of the house, horrified by the sounds of violence. His wife, in her panic, tripped and bruised her knee. The scene could have been straight out of a gangster film, but it was chillingly real. The family doctor, Frank Costa, was summoned to patch him up on the spot while police scoured the area. Buckshot shells were found littering the street, and although 3 shots had been fired, only 2 hit their mark. The first blast pierced the front door of Trafficante's car, just inches from where his head had been. Had it been slightly higher, it might have blown his brains out. The second shot ricocheted off the rear of the car, leaving a sizable dent behind the left window. And the third, it seemed, was still lodged in the barrel of the assailant's gun. Despite the clear attempt on his life, Trafficante claimed to have no idea who had shot at him. The car used in the attack was later abandoned at the intersection of 24th Street and Broadway. its driver vanishing into the night. As the investigation unfolded, a possible connection to Sam Tarrant, a known Chicago mobster now residing in Miami Beach, surfaced. A small envelope was found in Trafficante's car, containing a single dollar bill and the name Tarrant scrawled on it. The meaning behind this cryptic clue only deepened the mystery. Santo Trafficante Jr. had long been a fixture in Tampa's underworld. His power wasn't just confined to the city limits. His gambling operations stretched into Pinellas, Sarasota, Polk, and even Orange County. His name had appeared in the headlines before, often linked to violent incidents, but none more notorious than the afternoon he and Barrett W. Stevenson were found at a house on Riverdale Avenue, right in the middle of a search for another mob boss, Harlan Blackburn. Sitting in the living room as state investigators stormed the place, Trafficante, cool as ever, claimed he had just walked in because the door was open. That same day, September 22nd, René Nunez and Angelo Giglio were gunned down, their bodies left to rot on the side of the road. Trafficante had been quietly escorted into the sheriff's office and grilled by Governor Warren's investigator, J.J. Elliott. Despite the suspicions swirling around him, he walked out without a scratch, untouched by the law once again. The drama didn't stop there. Both Santo Trafficante Jr. and his father had been subpoenaed to testify in the Kefauver Committee's hearings on organized crime, but both had mysteriously disappeared when their time came. It was as if the earth itself had swallowed them up, leaving authorities empty-handed and frustrated. This latest shooting, however, had thrust the younger Trafficante back into the spotlight. A man of many interests, Trafficante owned several prominent bars around town: the Tangerine Tavern, the Nebraska Bar, and the Flamingo Bar and Lounge. His gambling empire was said to rake in nearly $1 million a year, a figure that sent shivers down the spines of his competitors and law enforcement alike. Ralph Mills, the hard-nosed head of the County Crime Commission, described Trafficante's syndicate as the single most powerful force in Tampa's criminal underworld. On October 6th, just days after the attack, Mills addressed the Exchange Club with an ominous warning. On Saturday, September 20th, 1952, Santo Trafficante Jr. and his mob suffered their first serious blow in this county. But the Mafia never took a hit lying down. In true mob fashion, vengeance was swift. The streets of Tampa had once again become a battlefield, and Trafficante, the man who seemed untouchable, was now in the crosshairs. Not long after the attack on Trafficante, Charlie Wall was found by his wife in their home, his throat slit from ear to ear in a savage, unmistakable message. The murder was never officially solved, but everyone knew the truth. All signs pointed to the man with the cold green eyes. As the bloodshed mounted in Tampa, Trafficante knew it was time to move. The timing was perfect for him to slip out of town. In 1953, he hopped on a plane to Havana, escaping the escalating violence. While Lansky was busy putting his empire in order, Trafficante didn't need him. He had carved his own path. Santo Trafficante Jr., through his father, Santo Trafficante Sr., was already a rising power in Havana's underworld, holding a stake in the Comodoro Hotel and Casino, and partnering with Amleto Battisti at the Hotel Sevilla Biltmore for narcotics smuggling. While dealing with his legal issues, Lansky kept his focus on Cuba, waiting patiently for the call from Batista that he knew would come. The takeover of Cuba was anything but the smooth operation people like to imagine. It was a chaotic scramble for power involving some of the most notorious mobsters in history: Meyer Lansky, Charles Lucky Luciano, Santo Trafficante Sr. as well as Jr., Frank Costello, the Corsican Mafia, Thew Cuban Mafia, and a host of others. Each had their reasons for wanting a slice of the island. Lansky, the financial wizard of the underworld, dreamed of transforming Cuba into his personal gambling paradise, a sun-soaked haven where the roulette wheels never stopped spinning and the dice were always hot. Luciano, after his deportation, eyed Cuba as his new kingdom, a safe haven from his troubles in America. But by 1947, all those grand plans began to unravel. The allure of Cuba for mobsters was crystal clear. In the United States, they struggled to secure legal licenses for gambling, liquor, and other lucrative ventures due to their criminal records. Cuba, however, was a different story, a place where no one cared too much about a shady past. The island was seen as a golden opportunity, an untapped goldmine for organized crime. Lansky, ever the strategist, spent decades trying to tighten his grip on it. But between mafia wars in New York, power struggles in Chicago, and the endless task of organizing the chaotic web of crime across the country, his plans were constantly delayed. The 1930s brought slow but steady progress. Then World War II hit, and with it, Lansky's empire took a blow. Tourism dried up, his operations came to a crawl, and the war effort took precedence over all else. By the 1950s, things looked even bleaker. Senator Estes Kefauver's relentless crusade against organized crime put the heat on Lansky's American operations, leaving his once flourishing empire in tatters. Lansky, a man of deep pride despite his quiet demeanor, began to reflect. He had interest in countless ventures, but nothing truly his own, nothing he could proudly call his legacy. The grim reality hit him. America would never be a place where someone like him could thrive openly. But in Cuba, that was another story. There, he could stamp his name on something grand, and after the war, organized crime tightened its stranglehold on the island. December 1946 was a turning point. Around Christmas, in the heat and glamour of Cuba, some of the most infamous and powerful figures in organized crime gathered for a historic sit-down. They arrived in waves, the top mobsters from across the United States, many of whom had been present at the Hotel Nacional conference earlier that month. It was always understood that when the money started pouring in, these men would get their fair share. From Cleveland came the likes of Sam Tucker, Morris Kleinman, and Modalitz, veterans of the Mayfield Road Gang, partners in Lansky's Molaska Corporation, and future players in Las Vegas. Tall, slender Vincent Jimmy Blue Eyes Allo, representing the Chicago outfit, was also in attendance. Allo, who would later be immortalized as the sinister Johnny Ola in The Godfather Part 2, rubbed shoulders with legendary figures like Joe Adonis, Albert Anastasia, Joe Bonanno, Frank Costello, Red Levine, Tommy Lucchese, Joe Profaci, and Giuseppe Joe Magliocco, among others. The list of attendees was a veritable who's who of the underworld. Willie Moretti, Augie Pisano, Mike Miranda, all gathered to stake their claim. Chicago came in force, represented by Tony Accardo, who was rapidly expanding his influence by taking over the racing wire services. The Fischetti brothers were present, as was Carlos Marcello, the fearsome boss of New Orleans, accompanied by his silver dollar. Sam was also present. Phil Castile was there too, though without any real power, much like Lansky himself, who also had no voting rights during this pivotal meeting. In the cabanas by the pool at the Hotel Nacional, Lansky and his fellow mobsters would often meet for quiet discussions over sandwiches and low-stakes card games. It wasn't about the money on the table, it was about the business, the camaraderie, and the sheer power that radiated from these men. There, in the shadows of Havana's most glamorous hotel, the future of organized crime was quietly being reshaped. Havana, as well as Miami, was an open playground for mobsters from every corner of the country. From Detroit to New Orleans, and of course New York, they all had a hand in the city's lucrative businesses. But once you stepped outside Miami's city limits, the rest of Florida and parts of Cuba belonged to the Trafficante crime family. Even a small fraction of Meyer Lansky's ventures in Miami and Cuba had to pay some tribute to Santo Trafficante. Yet, despite their business dealings, These two men, Lansky and Trafficante, harbored a deep distrust for each other. As both Luciano and I have said before, in the early 1950s, they neither liked nor trusted one another. However, one man who had both men's respect was Vincent Jimmy Blue Eyes Allo, the stoic yet fiercely loyal right-hand man of Meyer Lansky, spent his life entrenched in the heart of organized crime's golden age. When illness struck Allo, it was Lansky and his devoted wife, Flo, who stood by his side, caring for him as if he were family. After all, the Allos, who had no children of their own, were like kin to the Lanskys. Allo, a proud Italian-American, had roots stretching across Harlem, the Bronx, and the gritty streets of the Lower East Side. Born on May 26, 1904, Allo grew up in the shadow of legends, Charles Lucky Luciano and Lansky himself, two names that would forever be etched in the annals of the Mafia. By the mid-1930s, Allo and Lansky had become formidable business partners, their ventures spanning the underworld and cementing their place in Mafia history. Allo's connections ran deep, right to the very heart of the New York Mafia, aligning himself with none other than Vito Genovese, the infamous Italian-born boss revered as the boss of bosses. Though known for his calm demeanor and well-read mind, Allo's body bore the scars of a tough life, a bullet wound near his heart, and a left arm that had been broken more times than one could count. Allo's criminal career saw him serving two major prison sentences. The first, a brutal 7 to 12-year stint in Sing Sing prison in 1923, followed an armed bank robbery. Half a century later, Allo found himself behind bars again, this time in a minimum security prison in Georgia. He was convicted on 2 counts of obstruction of justice, dodging questions during a Securities and Exchange Commission investigation into Scopitone Incorporated, a Miami-based company whose jukebox rights were held by none other than Alvin Malnick. As South Florida's most infamous gangster, Allo was not just a relic of the past. He was the past, a living testament to an era when organized crime ruled with an iron fist. Allo's story ended on a Friday in Miami, where he passed away at the ripe old age of 96, just a year after suffering a cerebral hemorrhage. He may have left quietly, but his legacy roared. Alongside Lansky, Allo operated the legendary carpet joints of pre-World War II Hollywood and Hallandale. The Colonial Inn and Greenacres were not just illegal gambling dens. They were the cornerstone of an empire that would stretch from Florida to the casinos of Cuba. After Lansky's death, Allo didn't abandon the family. Instead, he took it upon himself to care for Lansky's son, Buddy, who suffered from cerebral palsy. Despite his connections to the most powerful mafia figures, Allo lived much of his later years in quiet solitude, residing in Hollywood. In the 1940s, he had built a grand stucco house on South Lake for his beloved Flo, and, after her passing in the 1970s, Allo moved to the Sea Air Towers, where he remained until his final days. Yet even in his quieter moments, Allo's presence loomed large. His niece, Carol Russo, wrote a great book about Jimmy, and she speaks of him fondly, remembering the man behind the legend. And though Allo often stayed in the shadows, his role in Lansky's criminal empire did not go unnoticed. Vincent Teresa, a crime figure turned informant, once revealed the truth. He's the mob's watchdog. He watches Lansky, making sure no one ever dares shortchange the crime bosses. Allo's reputation was such that anyone foolish enough to even think of crossing Lansky would find themselves staring down Jimmy Blue Eyes in an instant. As the decades rolled on, the Mafia lost much of its stranglehold on the nation. A former high-ranking Justice Department official even noted that when Robert Kennedy became Attorney General, the power of the national syndicate began to crumble. They exploited the public, took over industries, but now we're losing the old-school people who wreaked havoc and lived by their own code, said Gerald Scher, founder of the Witness Protection Program. There is nothing today that compares. The syndicate they built was unrivaled. Allo, the man who had outlasted nearly all of them, is survived by his brother Joseph Alo, a retired doctor living in Fort Lauderdale, and his niece Carol Russo. A memorial service was held in his honor at Lithgow Bennett Philbrick Funeral Home, and Alo's final resting place will be in New York, the city where his journey first began. In the end, Alo may have been a man of few words, but his life spoke volumes, an enduring reminder of a bygone era when the mob ruled, and men like Jimmy Blue Eyes enforced its unbreakable code. Another mob boss who had all 5 men's respect, which was Trafficante Jr. as well as Sr., Carlos Marcello, Meyer Lansky, and Jimmy Blue Eyes, and was extremely crucial in regard to handling these 5 individuals, and his name was Russell Bufalino, who became one of Meyer Lansky's closest friends and confidants, was a key figure in the complex web of mob alliances. Unlike many others, Russell had the unique ability to bridge the gap between factions that didn't trust each other. Figures like Santo Trafficante and Carlos Marcello would listen to Bufalino, and that was no small feat. Bufalino, like Trafficante and Marcello, was of Sicilian descent. The Buffalo Mob was one of the oldest crime syndicates in America. Luciano had deep amounts of respect for them, and that included Stefano Magaddino. This gave Russell an edge in dealing with them. Bufalino's true strength came from his ability to navigate the treacherous waters between these factions. He was one of the few mobsters who could operate seamlessly between the Southern Mafia, the New York Mafia, and the Pennsylvania crime family. The Detroit Partnership involved not just Joe Adonis or Frank Costello, but also had Russell Bufalino, the Chicago outfit, through Giancana and Accardo, as well as overseeing operations in Havana, Cuba. If there were ever any issues that the Trafficante family needed to address within Lansky's sphere of influence, they would often go through Bufalino or men like Mike Miranda, Carlo Gambino, or Magaddino. His ability to mediate between these powerful, distrustful figures made him a critical player in the underworld's power dynamics. There were plenty of reasons for the animosity. Lansky was staunchly against the narcotics operations that Trafficante and the New Orleans crime families were running. In Lansky's eyes, drug trafficking was reckless, too risky for men who already had the world at their feet. He once said, "When you've been a heavyweight, why risk it all by dabbling in something as dangerous as dope?" By March 1953, the Caribbean had become a magnet for high-rolling gamblers and shadowy figures from the underworld. As political instability swept across Cuba and Haiti, the region's tropical allure masked a darker reality, an island that was now under the control of organized crime. The Saturday Evening Post dispatched a reporter to the islands to uncover the truth behind the glamorous casinos and luxurious hotels that were cropping up from Havana to Port-au-Prince. During the 1940s and 1950s, Florida, especially Miami, had already become a hub for mobsters, with the notorious Meyer Lansky at the helm of lucrative operations. Now, with increasing scrutiny from U.S. authorities, many of these criminals fled south, turning the Caribbean into a new haven for vice and corruption. As the journalist from the Saturday Evening Post would soon discover, the influence of American money and mafia muscle was reshaping the island economies, and not for the better. It's New Year's Eve, and the place is the Grand Casino National in Havana, Cuba. Our main figure is a distinguished elderly gentleman, let's call him DJ, who is discovering why Havana is hailed as one of the last great sinful cities of the world. Outside, where a tropical moon bathes the casino gardens in soft light, the vibrant hues of hibiscus and bougainvillea bloom in a riot of color. Americans, dressed to the nines, battle their way noisily into the casino driveway, bumper to bumper. Inside, in the bar, laughter crescendos as midnight approaches on this 1951 New Year's Eve. In the grand ballroom, the sultry wail of a mambo band blends with the chatter of the dancers into an insistent roar. But in the gambling room, DJ is oblivious to it all. His world has suddenly shrunk to the pitchman's table, where the green felt numbered squares, the 8 dice in his hand, and a small fortune in house money spread before him are all that matters. The dice cup rattles, and the dealer's deft fingers count and whisk the dice away before the player's anxiously shining eyes can even tally them. Back home in New England, DJ is an insurance executive known for his solid judgment. But here, in Havana's irresistible heat, he has already lost 3 times what his salary would be in a year. The impassive house credit man, standing beside the pitchman's table, notes another $1,000 on the tally, bringing DJ's debt to the house to $4,000. DJ hesitates. "Shame to quit now," murmurs a stranger to his left. "The only way the house can win is if he quits now," adds a tall man lounging nearby. Spurred by these remarks, DJ, his eyes bulging from the stress, presses on. I had watched the tableaus unfold with growing disbelief at the open, unrelenting swindle. The game, at which this sweating little executive was losing $1,000 every half minute, was nothing short of a carnival con. No casino outside Havana, outraged gambling men later told me, would ever allow such an outright fraud. No one can defeat a game where 8 dice are rolled, and players double their bets with every roll. The double or nothing trick, the speed of the game, and the smooth pitch of the houseman combined into a seamless strategy to crush the players. Hemmed in on all sides, the rabbit, as they called the mark, was stripped of everything he had on him, and eventually of his entire bank account back home. When DJ's losses hit the $6,000 mark, his wife, visibly distressed, quietly moved away. I followed her, but not for long. The thin man who had been kibitzing near DJ locked his arm firmly around mine. "People who don't mind their own business get into trouble," he said. Before I could respond, the man to DJ's left, a broad-shouldered Cuban in a dinner jacket, took hold of my other arm. "This house is run by the Cuban government," he said. "Any complaints? You talk to me. I'm the police." In a matter of seconds, I was ejected from the gambling room. DJ's wife had disappeared without a word. I later learned that DJ had lost $8,600 in 11 minutes before collapsing in a faint. More than 100,000 Americans visited the Caribbean last year. Many of them belong to that burgeoning class who, lured by the allure of low-cost package tours, find themselves entering a gambling casino for the first time. They are naive, unprepared for the trap set against them. Yet gambling, a forbidden fruit at home, is being dangled freely before them in Cuba, and many, like DJ, are booked for extinction. The honest and the gullible don't stand a chance. The Kefauver Senate crime investigation that dried up big-time gambling in the United States has pushed unemployed gamblers to the Caribbean in droves. Within the last few years, gangsters from Detroit's Purple Gang, the Chicago Underworld, the Pittsburgh Mob, and the New York syndicates have moved into Havana in such numbers that the city has become a haven for the criminal underworld in exile. The Caribbean islands, governed by their own laws, have capitalized on American enthusiasm for gambling as part of their economic revival. Cuba, Haiti, the Dominican Republic, and Puerto Rico all dream of becoming the new Riviera of the West. They aim to cash in on Americans' thirst for gambling, just as Cuba profited from bootlegging during Prohibition. Gambling is so crucial to Puerto Rico that the island's legislature recently legalized it, and this year, the insular government sponsored a trade school to train croupiers and dealers for the gambling industry. Haiti, equally determined to accommodate American tourists, used its diplomats to invite the biggest gambling operators to set up shop in the Republic. When that failed, Haiti's ambassador to Italy pulled off a major diplomatic coup. He convinced a high-ranking Italian casino operator to accept a monopoly over all of Haiti's gambling operations and open a casino in Port-au-Prince. The Dominican Republic last year loaded a 36-passenger plane with slot machines, blackjack tables, and dealers. They christened it the Lady Luck and announced that a carefree weekend in Ciudad Trujillo was available at a low cost. Customs and Internal Revenue agents in Miami turned the gambling plane back as an illegal operation, but the Dominicans found other ways to attract Americans to their elegant casinos. In Nassau, where the Bahamian Club has long catered to the elite, local entrepreneurs have made provisions for more casual customers. Bars, restaurants, and other tourist attractions are quietly adding craps and blackjack tables in back rooms to create a gambling experience for tourists of all types. One man familiar with the expansion of Caribbean gambling operations, Charlie Freed of Monterey Woodcraft Company in Miami, summed it up. "We used to do only 5% of our business in the Caribbean," said Freed, who sells $200,000 worth of gambling equipment annually in the United States. "Now we do 95% of our business on the islands. Havana has replaced what we used to do in the States. That's where the future of gambling lies, in the islands." The future is already here. A chain of gambling joints, lavishly appointed for the tourist trade, stretches from Havana and Varadero in Cuba to San Juan in Puerto Rico. In these establishments, Americans are leaving behind such vast amounts of folding money that it seems like they are privately financing their own Point 4 program. The revenue is making it possible for island governments and private investors to build some of the most breathtaking hotels in the world, hotels that American dollar built. At the Caribe Hilton Hotel in San Juan, which cost the Puerto Rican government $7,200,000, a gambling casino occupies nearly the same amount of space as the hotel's ballroom. According to government sources, the casino generates 60% of the hotel's profits. The casino's earnings, which amount to around $600,000 a year, have kept the hotel in the black since its opening and are helping to finance the construction of additional hotels. This is the contribution that American tourists make when gambling is packaged as part of the vacation experience, especially in Puerto Rico. For those who operate gambling in the islands, and for governments like Cuba's, which are grappling with internal struggles, the challenge becomes, how do we stop Havana's crooked gambling houses from killing tourism? The answer may lie with the individual tourists who are being plucked, those American lobsters lured into losing their money at every corner. In 4 out of 5 casinos in Havana, experienced gamblers have long avoided the tables. But the systematic fleecing of unsuspecting tourists started in earnest last year, when a grifter known as Martino arrived in Havana with a master layout for a scam. Martino's first operation was at the Sanssouci Club, where tourists could dine on a $4.60 steak dinner under moonlit palm trees, while enjoying a voodoo-inspired 6-hour cabaret show. The chief figure at the Sanssouci was Sammy Fianuno, an ex-Pittsburgh racketeer, burglar, and convicted thief. In January 2 years ago, Chicago and Detroit interests, including Joe Magliocco, also known as Joe Mayo, an old-time chief of Detroit's Purple Gang, moved in as partners. Martino and his crew initially struck a deal with the casino owners for a 50-50 split, taking 60% of the profits and leaving 40% for the house. Martino pulled in $30,000 on his first night. Over the next few nights, his take increased to between $80,000 and $120,000 per evening. When the owners of Sanssouci saw their profits shrinking too quickly, they cancelled the deal and put Martino on a salary with a commission. Martino's fraud quickly spread across Havana, showing up in the Casino Nacional, which was operated by the remnants of Miami's defunct S&G gambling syndicate. The scheme soon appeared at the Jockey Club, run by American concessionaires in the Parque Central racetrack, and eventually found its way to the Tropicana Club. Owned by Cubans who had made their initial fortunes in the illicit numbers game, the Tropicana Club is now valued at $2 million and is regarded as the most famous nightclub in the Western Hemisphere. At the Tropicana, dinner costs $60 per plate, with an Afro-Cuban floor show as the main attraction, and, of course, a significant profit to be made. To maximize these profits, the club owners hired the most skilled conmen and pitchmen, like Billy Bloom. Bloom's deal reveals much about the money-making potential of the game. He turns over $1,000 a month for his concession and spends several $100s on drinks and other entertainments. In return, he keeps 60% of the profits while the house retains 40%. There's enough for everyone. When I checked into Havana's Hotel Nacional in 1952, the casino was buzzing with activity. Games, shell tricks, and roulette wheels spinning with calamity. All this came to an end when the Cuban government, under pressure, ordered a crackdown on gambling. So many tourists had been swindled that their complaints reached the American Embassy and Cuba's Tourism Commission. Among the victims was a honeymoon couple who lost the $500 they had saved to furnish their new home. Another was a mother of 4 who lost her husband's entire weekly salary in a rigged dice game. One international incident involved Dana Smith, an American lobbyist and a sponsor of Vice President Richard Nixon's senatorial campaign fund. Smith had given a check for $200, thinking it was for a fun night out, but when he stopped payment, he was sued in an American court and won. The court found the game he had played was fraudulent and illegal under Cuban law. This prompted Cuba's Minister of the Interior to announce that all gambling would be suspended by government decree. Since Cuba's gambling industry was illegal and operated only under protection, the decree dealt a severe blow. American gangsters, hoping for thriving enterprises both abroad and at home, saw their dreams crushed. In Havana, the frauds had become so blatant that Cuban croupiers began warning fellow countrymen to stick to roulette if they wanted to gamble. Even roulette could be rigged, but only by highly skilled cheats. At a crooked craps table, however, the house's cut was more than a player could handle. A masterful mechanic known as a button man could manipulate or load the dice, ensuring outcomes that consistently favored the house. When the player thought the roll was random, the dice were already stacked against him. Skilled mechanics could adjust the dice by as little as 0.005 of an inch from a corner, enough to ensure a specific outcome. As the players lost more and more, the casino continued to rake in money. "I wish you good luck dealing with the blackjack cheats in Havana," said Bagnowani, a veteran gambler from Milan who operated the casino at Port-au-Prince in Haiti. The blackjack dealers were trained to subtly manipulate the cards, and finding honest blackjack tables in Havana was nearly impossible. Despite these rampant frauds, many tourists still found themselves returning to the same gambling houses, lured in by the thrill of the game and oblivious to the traps set against them. As they emptied their wallets, these American visitors unknowingly fueled the profits of Havana's crooked casinos. The tourist who considers stopping payment on their check will find that the casinos have a system in place to beat them to the punch. Daily, when gambling wraps up around 4 in the morning, several Havana casinos rush players' checks to the airport to be flown to Miami. Waiting for their arrival is Reginald Reynolds, president and manager of Inter-American Check Service, Inc., with offices in the Saybold Building in Miami. With the help of a clerk at Pan American Bank of Miami, Reynolds gets to work. First, he determines whether there's enough money in the player's hometown bank to cover the gambling check. Several banks exchange this information as a courtesy, and a quick phone call or telegram from Reynolds's bank will bring the answer. If the funds are available, Reynolds airmails the player's check with a notation, "Please wire fate," meaning, "Please inform whether the check has cleared." Upon receiving a favorable reply by wire, Reynolds pays the casino immediately, deducting 2% of the check's value as a fee, plus the cost of phone calls and telegrams. This system allows the casino, which would otherwise wait over a week for the check to clear, to receive the money within 24 hours. Although this setup resolves debts in Havana promptly, players' bounced checks and other irregularities remain a common issue. In a 3-month period, bad checks amounted to $250,000. From Havana, an island-hopping plane whisks gamblers to Haiti in just a few hours. Approximately 20,000 Americans visit Haiti yearly, and 2 exotic hotels in the cloud-shrouded hills above Port-au-Prince, the El Rancho and the Ibo Lele, stand as symbols of America's contribution to the impoverished country's economy. But the man who can tell you the most about American contributions is Count Alberto Zorrilla, operator of the National Casino in Port-au-Prince, a man of noble birth, suave continental charm, and, thanks to his casino, great insight into the American character. The American gambler is an impulsive fellow, the Count said. He sets no limits for himself, neither in time nor money. The European takes it easy, plays slowly, takes a rest. The American sits down and won't get up until he's completely drained. The Count wasn't complaining, of course. Last year, he paid the Haitian government $200,000 in taxes, which was 20% of his profits. Given that, the Count's take amounted to $1 million. A colony of Syrian merchants and diplomats had helped themselves to the rest of the profits, but Americans were the chief contributors. Gambling in the Caribbean pays for more hotels, which brings in more tourists, who spend more money at the casinos, which then finance more hotels. The Count planned to reinvest his casino profits into a hotel and villas. Once these were filled with tourists, he'd open another casino. From Haiti, a 55-minute airplane ride takes you to the Dominican Republic. In the capital, Ciudad Trujillo, signs of American influence are everywhere. The monumental Jaragua Hotel, an American hotel on Mount San Cristobal, overlooks the Caribbean and Washington Avenue. Up the street is a statue of Cordell Hull, and the town's secondary school is called the United States High School. So, it follows that the leading gambling figure in the Dominican Republic is José Nud Simonis, a sharp-eyed, blue-eyed Latin who was raised in the States, talks and thinks like an American, and is called Joe. When the games are going strong, Joe said, they're lined up 3 deep, waiting for a chance at the wheel or the craps table. I saw what this meant to the local economy when an American cruise ship arrived from New Orleans, filling the hotel's casino, one of only 2 in town, with fresh tourists carrying pockets full of money. A Dallas doctor, playing at the craps table, placed his chips down on bets with a house advantage as high as 27%. Around the table, other Americans were making similar bets, all of which slowly drained their cash into the casino. An elderly woman from Chicago fed quarters into a slot machine, losing 20 without hitting a single win. All this was pushing the Dominican economy forward, turning gambling into a national monument. This casino alone, Joe said, netted $300,000 in its first year. When you land at San Juan's airport, a 2-foot-high banner reminds you that Puerto Rico is American soil. It reads, "Welcome to Puerto Rico, USA." Puerto Rico is indeed the only American commonwealth besides Nevada that has legalized gambling. However, the conscientious men who run the island's government haven't fully embraced it. "It's a tolerated evil," said Teodoro Moscoso, the administrator of economic development, "and we're scared to death of it." Governor Luis Muñoz Marin's administration hesitated before allowing gambling, even after much debate and study showed that casinos would contribute to the economy. But Puerto Rico took precautions. First, the government created a school for croupiers. 102 students, carefully selected for their talents and character, filled the classrooms to learn the tricks of the trade. They studied the art of rolling dice, spinning roulette wheels, and running card tables. The students mastered the odds, the calculations for a hard 4 and a hard 6, and the mathematical workings of probability. Their graduation diplomas bore the seal of the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico and were signed by the Administrator of Economic Development. This project produced honest native dealers to replace the clever American card sharks with their thousands of tricks for fleecing the unsuspecting tourist. Then, when the casinos opened, the government brought in an expert. John Scarborough, a hospitality executive from Miami, who probably had the oddest mission of anyone in the industry. He was tasked with training dealers in spotting cheaters at cards and craps. Scarborough's methods were known only to one government official and himself. His training measures proved to be preventive and effective. One was to use croupiers' dice sticks, rounded at the ends, to prevent dealers from switching in loaded dice. By calculating the volume of play and the odds, Scarborough could also advise the house on how much it should expect to earn per hour. Puerto Rico's gambling, John Scarborough told me, gives players as fair a break as they'll find in any casino in the world, whether it's in Las Vegas or Monte Carlo. In the long run, the odds always favor the house. We caught hell from the opposition when we plunged $7,200,000 into a luxury hotel, the Caribe Hilton, Governor Munoz Marin said. But we're making 12% on our money. The insular government, as owner, takes 2/3 of the profits, while the Hilton Corporation, as operator, receives 1/3. The gambling rooms at the hotel, frequented by American cabinet members, senators and movie stars, should be booked solid with package tour travelers. The operations are responsible and tightly run. Puerto Rico's gambling law requires anyone applying for a casino license to invest at least $150,000 in building new facilities or refurbishing old ones. The success of the Caribe Hilton's prosperity has inspired local owners of the Condado Beach Hotel to spend $1 million upgrading their facilities. The end. Only 3 years into 1950, Lansky, once the shadowy puppeteer behind untold fortunes, would find himself staring at prison bars, his empire crumbling like sand slipping through his fingers. The newspapers were ablaze with tales of infamous criminals, igniting a firestorm of public fascination. The Kefauver hearings dragged notorious figures into the harsh glare of the spotlight, transforming them into living legends. At the center of these whispers and headlines stood none other than Charlie "Lucky" Luciano. Deported in 1947, Luciano's name still sent shivers through the alleys of New York, where mobsters schemed in smoke-filled backrooms. Frank Costello's name danced through these articles, as did murmurs of the feared Vito Genovese. These men were the titans of crime, operating with the cold efficiency of a machine. Yet the truth behind their operations remained shrouded in speculation, theories slowly solidifying as evidence began to pile up. Red Levine, the enigmatic hitman, had been a whisper in the wind, his legacy reduced to footnotes in organized crime law. Levine, once a loyal enforcer for Luciano, had famously taken part in the murder of Salvatore Maranzano, an assassination that had altered the course of mafia history. His violent deeds had propelled him to infamy, but finding his name in print was rare, as if his deeds were too dark to be fully uncovered. Despite this, the mention of Levine, alongside these larger-than-life figures, illustrated the brutal reality of the time. No gangster, no matter how ruthless or loyal, was immune to the coming storm. The Kefauver hearings had another unintended consequence. They cast men like Lansky, Luciano, and Levine into the fabric of American mythology. Suddenly, these criminals were not merely underground figures. They were celebrities. Headlines blared their names like Hollywood stars, and their stories became as gripping as any film noir. But while fame may have stroked their egos, it burned holes in their empires. Meanwhile, Red Levine's shadow lingered over the criminal landscape. Despite rarely being the focus of media attention, his brutal efficiency had kept him firmly entrenched in the underworld's hierarchy. As arrests swept through New York's organized crime circles in 1950, Levine found himself caught in the dragnet, part of a wave of indictments that included hundreds of other mobsters. These sweeping arrests, however, were just a glimpse into the broader chaos. Law enforcement was cracking down in a desperate attempt to sever the roots of the mafia's sprawling network, and Levine's capture marked the beginning of the end for some of the most untouchable gangsters of the time. The crackdown, led by Chief of Detectives Conrad Rothengast, was a high-stakes game of cat and mouse. On a fateful day at Jamaica Racetrack in Queens, detectives swarmed, rounding up 25 criminals in a single swoop. Among them, Levine stood out. The very man who murdered Maranzano. Red was a long-time Luciano associate, his name dripping with the blood of past murders. The operation was part of a larger effort, as police made over 126 arrests in just 24 hours. These weren't just small-time crooks. Men like Anthony Ricci, Capone's former right-hand man, were now in the crosshairs. Ricci, who had once wielded power within the Sicilian mafia like a king on a chessboard, found himself cuffed and humiliated. The criminal empire was rotting from within, and the raids were simply pushing it into the light. For Meyer Lansky, Red Levine and their ilk, the 1950s were a battlefield. The golden era of untouchable mobsters was slowly fading as law enforcement and politicians like Kefauver hammered away at their carefully built empires. Yet even in their downfall, their names remained immortal, entwined with the gritty, dangerous allure of America's criminal underworld. The decade wasn't just an end. It was the transformation of these men from shadowy figures into enduring legends. But the price they paid was high, and the consequences were far from over. The shadows of the past were catching up, and the future held no promises of safety or redemption. The Kefauver hearings, a relentless campaign by law enforcement to tear apart the mafia, had done more than just uncover dirty secrets. They had ripped open the soul of organized crime, exposing its weaknesses and vulnerabilities. And the men who had once ruled with an iron fist, Costello, Adonis, the Mangano brothers, Genovese, Luciano, Moretti, were now crumbling under the pressure. In the shadowy corridors of organized crime, where loyalty was fragile and ambition was deadly, the internal power struggles of the 1950s churned like a storm brewing just beyond the horizon. Lucky Luciano, though exiled in Italy, remained deeply connected to the pulse of New York's criminal underworld. News of the rising tensions, betrayals, and shifting allegiances troubled him, none more so than the quiet but dangerous ascent of Carlo Gambino. Luciano knew all too well that Vito Genovese, despite being troublesome, could be contained. Genovese was a known entity, a bulldog who bit hard but was predictable. However, it was Gambino, with his calm demeanor and calculating patience, which gave Luciano pause. Gambino was not one to rush to power. Like a wolf in sheep's clothing, he maneuvered silently, positioning himself as a key figure within the Mangano crime family, where he served as a lieutenant under the ruthless Albert Anastasia. Alongside Frank Scalise, Gambino had carefully curated his reputation, emerging as the heir apparent to Anastasia's empire. He was a man with ambition, but he wore it like a mask, hidden until the moment was right. Luciano had long seen the writing on the wall. In private conversations with Meyer Lansky, the two masterminds often traded thoughts on the delicate balance of power within the New York families. Lansky, ever the keen observer, predicted with eerie accuracy that one day Anastasia might turn on the Mangano brothers, Phil and Vincent, and take control of the entire organization. The Mangano brothers had long ruled with a heavy hand, but their leadership was waning, and Anastasia's desire for dominance was palpable. True to Lansky's grim forecast, 1951 marked a turning point. Phil Mangano was found dead, his body left as a brutal testament to the internal strife, and Vincent disappeared without a trace, presumed to have met a similar fate. In the wake of their elimination, Anastasia assumed the role of boss, his control now unchallenged. The death of Philip Mangano, a man who once commanded power over Brooklyn's waterfront rackets, sent shockwaves through the mafia ranks and ignited whispers of betrayal. His body, discovered in the desolate marshlands near Bayside, bullet-riddled and lifeless, was more than a sign of murder. It was the opening act of a bloody purge. Philip Mangano, a 50-year-old racketeer, had been summoned to appear before District Attorney McDonald's investigation. But before he could testify, his body was found lying face down in the dirt, a victim of what was suspected to be a calculated hit. 3 bullets to the head, executed with chilling precision, marked his end, but the story was far from over. A high-ranking police official speaking under anonymity suggested this killing wasn't just another mob hit. It was a warning, an act of silencing a man who had allegedly spoken to federal agents and committee investigators. Mangano, after all, was no small player. He was entangled with the powerful Joe Adonis, a notorious figure in the mafia's web of criminal dealings. Adonis had recently been cited for contempt of Congress, and Mangano's demise only deepened the suspicion that the Kefauver Committee's investigation had made the mafia's inner circle nervous. The official's theory was grim. "This is likely to lead to an all-out war within the mafia," he said, foretelling a nightmarish chain of events that would see some of the most dangerous men in the underworld sleeping with one eye open. Mangano's death wasn't a simple elimination. It was a power play orchestrated from the highest echelons of the mafia, a chilling signal that no one, no matter how powerful, was beyond reach. Mangano's murder was discovered by Mary Gooch, a middle-aged woman who owned a nearby fishing shack. It was a stroke of dark irony that 2 years earlier she had found another body in nearly the same location. This place, a quiet, forgotten marshland south of Avenue Y, had become a dumping ground for the mafia's unfinished business. The details of Mangano's death were as stark as they were strange. Dressed in only a white shirt, black socks, and a gold tie clasp, still neatly fixed, his appearance suggested he had been taken by surprise. The rope under his body hinted at a sinister twist, a longshoreman's sling, used not for cargo, but for carrying a man to his death. It was clear Mangano hadn't walked to his final resting place. He had been taken for a ride, his life snuffed out elsewhere before his body was discarded like refuse. This killing bore all the hallmarks of an inside job, one that Vincent Mangano, Philip's brother, and another top mafia figure could not ignore. Philip's murder sent shockwaves not just through the streets of Brooklyn, but throughout the entire underworld. Vincent had been dodging investigators, and now, with his brother dead, he vanished completely. Whispers ran through the mafia that Vincent might be next, that this purge was far from over. For those who dared speculate, this was not just the death of a racketeer, but the start of a mafia war unlike any seen before. Tensions between rival factions had reached a breaking point. The old ways, reminiscent of the brutal bootlegging days, seemed to be returning with a vengeance. And as the blood spilled, men like Joe Adonis and Frank Costello stood accused of orchestrating the chaos, while the shadowy figure of Albert Anastasia loomed, waiting for his chance to seize power. The death of Philip Mangano was only the first strike in a larger, more dangerous game, a game where the cost of loyalty was life, and the price of betrayal was death. As the weeks unfolded, it became clear that no one was safe. The purge had begun, and in the world of the mafia, retribution was inevitable. As the fallout from Philip Mangano's murder spread through the streets of Brooklyn, the focus shifted to a man who had long managed to dodge the spotlight, Frank Costello. On the surface, Costello, often called the Prime Minister of the underworld, appeared calm, collected, and untouchable. But behind the scenes, his name was whispered in the same breath as the most dangerous men in the mafia. So, when Brooklyn District Attorney investigators dragged him into questioning about the murder of Mangano, it felt like the very air in the criminal world held its breath. Costello's questioning, handled by Assistant District Attorney Louis Andreozzi, might have seemed like an effort to crack open a treasure trove of mafia secrets, but the results were as expected. Silence. As stoic as ever, Costello gave the investigators nothing. His reputation preceded him. A man who could talk for hours and say absolutely nothing, and that's precisely what happened during his meeting with Andreozzi. His lawyer, George Wolfe, stood by his side, as impenetrable as his client. The questioning was a formality, nothing more. District Attorney Miles MacDonald, undeterred by Costello's silence, explained the reasoning behind the interrogation. "We are bringing in any witnesses who might be able to tell us about Mangano's associates. Once we know more about his connections, we can proceed from there." But everyone in that room knew the truth. If Costello knew anything about Philip Mangano's death, he wasn't about to reveal it. Not now, not ever. Still, the questioning opened the door to another name that sent shivers through the streets of Brooklyn: Joe Adonis. A Brooklyn mobster with deep ties to Mangano, Adonis had recently been cited for contempt of Congress after refusing to testify at the Kefauver hearings. Now he was next on the list. Though MacDonald indicated that Adonis would be questioned somewhere outside of this office, the tension was palpable. When Adonis sat down with investigators, it was unlikely they would get any more out of him than they had from Costello. And then there was Albert Anastasia, the brutal and feared king of the dock rackets, whose name hovered over this investigation like a dark cloud. Anastasia, alongside lower-level mafia figures like Tony Spring and Joe Fiorino, were names that came up repeatedly as possible targets for questioning. But MacDonald, perhaps wary of pushing too hard, remained non-committal. The interview with Costello had dampened his enthusiasm for interrogating other mafia big shots, at least for now. However, the name on everyone's mind was Vincent Mangano, the older brother of the slain Philip. Vincent had been a ghost since the Kefauver Committee began digging into the waterfront rackets that the Mangano brothers ruled with an iron fist. While the committee had managed to track down Philip before his death, Vincent had vanished. And now, as investigators tried to piece together the puzzle of Philip Mangano's murder, they were desperate to find Vincent, whose disappearance seemed more suspicious by the day. Some believed that if Philip Mangano hadn't spoken to the Kefauver Committee, he might still be alive. That suspicion, whether true or not, hung like a dark spectre over the investigation. The Mafia's code of silence, omerta, was the invisible thread tying all these men together. Costello, Adonis, Anastasia, and even the elusive Vincent Mangano. They were all bound by a common understanding. In this world, loyalty could mean the difference between life and death. And for Philip Mangano, it had already sealed his fate. Vincent Mangano vanished without a trace around April 19th, leaving behind one of the most perplexing mysteries in mafia history. To this day, no one knows what truly happened to him, and his murder remains unsolved. For years, every time a body was discovered in New Jersey, New York, or Brooklyn, newspapers would run the story, and families would brace themselves, wondering if it was Mangano. But each time, it wasn't him. His body never surfaced, and the crime that ended his life became one of the most infamous cold cases in organized crime. Yet, while the truth of his fate was hidden in the shadows, the aftermath of his disappearance was undeniable. Powerful figures like Frank Costello, Albert Anastasia, Joe Adonis, and others convened for a pivotal meeting. It was there that Anastasia, ever the calculating predator, made a chilling admission. He believed that the Mangano brothers were plotting to take him down, so he struck first. In the ruthless world of the mafia, This was the only language they understood: kill or be killed. Lucky Luciano, ever pragmatic, simply shrugged at the news. "It is what it is," he declared, knowing that nothing could be done to change the course now. He also warned that no further action should be taken, not with Senator Estes Kefauver's relentless hearings still casting a spotlight on organized crime. Costello, always thinking strategically, saw merit in Anastasia's move. After all, Anastasia was fiercely loyal to both him and Luciano, far more so than the Manganos ever were. But in this dangerous game, Costello underestimated the unpredictable nature of Anastasia. He was a loose cannon, volatile, uncontrollable, and quick to lash out. He had a penchant for promoting mobsters one day, only to publicly humiliate and demote them the next. His erratic behavior sparked resentment, especially in those who had once enjoyed his favor. Carlo Gambino, a sharp and calculating man, had been the underboss since 1946, only to find himself demoted and promoted again in a dizzying game of power that was less about rank and more about Anastasia's whims. While others might have seethed with rage, Gambino wisely swallowed his pride. He knew that making noise would only hasten his downfall. Instead, he chose patience, waiting for the right moment. Because Gambino understood something that others didn't. Albert Anastasia was digging his own grave. All Gambino had to do was bide his time and let Anastasia's own reckless nature take him down. The stage was set, the pieces were in motion, and Gambino was ready to seize the opportunity when the moment came. As the streets buzzed with rumors of a coming mafia war, it was clear that the Mangano purge had only just begun. The silence from the likes of Anastasia, Lansky, Costello, and Adonis was not a sign of weakness, but rather a demonstration of power, a reminder that, in their world, words could kill just as surely as bullets. But in the shadows, Carlo Gambino's ambitions stirred. Luciano, miles away but still deeply entrenched in the politics of the underworld, could sense it. The murder of the Mangano brothers had removed a significant obstacle, and Anastasia, despite his newfound power, was creating a vacuum that Gambino was bound to fill. Luciano, upon hearing the news of Phil's murder, knew instantly that Gambino would not stay a lieutenant for long. This will make Carlo ambitious, Luciano reflected. Gambino's rise was inevitable, and within just a few years, Luciano would be proven right again. As the 1950s wore on, Anastasia's reign grew increasingly unstable. The transformation that Luciano and Lansky had predicted was now complete, and the landscape of organized crime had irrevocably changed. Luciano, reflecting from afar, understood that the 50s were a turning point. The mobsters who had dominated the criminal underworld for decades were falling, one by one. Moretti, Siegel, the Mangano brothers, Anastasia, all casualties of an era that was being replaced by a new, more strategic generation of crime lords. Men like Gambino represented this shift, leaders who were willing to wait, to bide their time, and to strike only when the odds were in their favor. Luciano, in a rare move, had sent word back to New York, a message meant to quell the brewing storm. He warned Genovese and Gambino to cool their ambitions, particularly Genovese, who was already angling to take over Anastasia's operations. Luciano knew that if Genovese tried to muscle in too soon, the delicate balance of power would collapse into chaos. But alongside the warning, Luciano sent Gambino a private message. He acknowledged Gambino's rising influence and future potential, recognizing that within 10 or 15 years, Gambino could control it all. But he urged patience, telling Gambino to keep his pecker down, advising him to avoid unnecessary risks. This subtle recognition of Gambino's leadership abilities wasn't just a compliment. It was a calculated move to keep the peace and delay any further bloodshed. For a time, Luciano's message worked. Genovese was held at bay, and Gambino, ever the strategist, waited in the wings, content to let others burn out while he consolidated his power. But Luciano knew even then that the 40s were the closing act of one chapter and the prelude to another. The 50s would bring new challenges, new betrayals, and new opportunities for men like Gambino, Genovese, Giancana, Marcello, Trafficante Jr., Tommy Lucchese, Joe Bonanno, and other men who had learned that in the world of organized crime, patience and silence could be the sharpest weapons of all. Meyer Lansky, 50 years old and burdened with the weight of his sprawling empire, stood on precarious ground. His world, once solid and carefully constructed, was starting to splinter. The streets of New York, once his playground, now echoed with whispers of his impending downfall. And it wasn't just Lansky who was feeling the heat. The entire web of organized crime seemed to be fraying at the edges. Frank Costello, Lansky's longtime ally, was grappling with a public and personal crisis. Battling tax issues and health problems, Costello's throat cancer was eating away at his strength. His refusal to testify at the Kefauver hearings had only intensified his legal woes, painting a target on his back that the authorities couldn't ignore. Joe Adonis, another key figure, found himself on the verge of deportation. The lie he told about his immigration status had finally caught up to him, and his refusal to cooperate with the Kefauver hearings made his situation even more perilous. Across the crime landscape, powerful men were being dragged down by legal complications, the weight of their secrets too heavy to carry any longer. Meanwhile, Vito Genovese, once feared and respected, was being torn apart by his personal life. His wife, bitter and scorned, was pulling him through a vicious public divorce, airing out his dirty laundry for the world to see. She accused him not only of infidelity, but also of his deep connections to the criminal underworld, laying bare the vast network of rackets he controlled. This humiliation struck at the core of Genovese's reputation, and his carefully guarded finances were now the subject of courtroom debates. Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, once a close friend of Lansky, was long dead, but his death still cast a shadow. Rumors about who had orchestrated his murder continued to swirl, with Lansky's name occasionally surfacing in whispered speculation, questions about his role hanging like a dark cloud over his head. Willie Moretti, another major player, had paid the ultimate price for stepping into the public eye. His decision to testify made him a marked man, and by October 4th, 1951, he was dead murdered in a brazen hit that shook the foundations of organized crime. Lansky had seen it coming. To cooperate was to die. To stay silent was to survive, at least for a while. But the death of the Mangano brothers, a grim development Lansky supported through his ally Frank Costello, had caused even deeper fractures in the crime families. Albert Anastasia, the brutal leader who had removed the Mangano brothers, now found his family swelling to an uncontrollable size. Luciano, observing from afar in Italy, foresaw the chaos that would ensue. When Anastasia took out the Mangano brothers, Luciano remarked, he created a family too big to manage. And Carlo Gambino, the quiet and cunning Silver Fox, was rising fast through the ranks, positioning himself as a future power player. Luciano could sense the tremors of a looming power struggle that would only grow more violent. By the early 1950s, the walls were closing in on Lansky. His gambling operations in Florida and New York were collapsing under legal pressure, and the glamorous Saratoga Springs casinos that had once printed money for him were now under siege. His empire, once sprawling and indestructible, was beginning to fracture. For Meyer Lansky, the Kefauver hearings weren't just an assault on his operations. They were a personal attack, an existential threat to the empire he had spent decades building. In a seething confrontation with Senator Estes Kefauver, Lansky's rage boiled over. The senator, known for his own fondness for gambling, had struck a nerve. When Lansky, with the cold precision of a chess player making his move, questioned Kefauver's own gambling habits, the senator retorted, "That's quite right, but I don't want you people to control it." Lansky, seeing it as a jab at his heritage, snapped back, refusing to kneel to stereotypes or persecution. Yet, for all his bravado, Lansky's words fell flat in the courtroom. His ethnicity didn't matter here, only his crimes did. In September 1950, Lansky, alongside his brother Jake and the infamous Jimmy Blue Eyes, found themselves indicted on gambling charges. They pleaded guilty, opting for the easy way out, fines ranging from $1,000 to $3,000, a small price to pay for men who had ruled the underworld. Lansky declared a personal income of about $22,000 from those clubs in their final season. But by 1951 and 1952, his reported income was a pittance, just $1,200 and $1,500 in dividends from his shares. The mighty had fallen, and Lansky, the sharpest mind in organized crime, needed to show some legitimate earnings to satisfy the IRS, which was scrutinizing everyone who had come under the glare of the Kefauver hearings. Lansky had always operated in cash, keeping the IRS at arm's length. He stashed money in at least 5 different safe deposit boxes scattered across New York, Newark, Boston, and Hollywood, Florida. When he did use bank accounts, his transactions were purposefully simple and anonymous. Bundles of cash moving through Manufacturers Trust of New York in amounts ranging from $700 to $16,000. Between March 1944 and December 1947, prime years for his gambling empire, Lansky deposited a total of $119,000, averaging about $2,500 per month. But it wasn't the IRS that worried Lansky during his time in the Ballston Spa jail in 1953. It was something far more chilling, the possibility of being sent back to Russia. As 1953 carried on, Meyer Lansky, the man with a mind sharper than a switchblade, found himself walking a tightrope over the seething cauldron of the American underworld. The new decade came crashing in like a tidal wave, slamming against the very foundations of organized crime. Lansky's empire, once seemingly indestructible, was now buckling under the immense pressure of legal scrutiny, internal betrayals, and shifting allegiances. His old allies were either dead or disgraced. Moretti had been murdered, Costello was unraveling, Luciano was exiled soon to be joined by Joe Adonis and multiple others, as well as Genovese was spiraling into chaos. And now Lansky found himself standing in the stark light of a courtroom in Ballston Spa, New York. Facing Justice Leo Haerty, Lansky, a man who had always operated in the shadows, pulling the strings of the underworld, was now out in the open, vulnerable and exposed. He pleaded guilty to his involvement in gambling and conspiracy, a desperate attempt to avoid a harsher fate. But as Haerty handed down the sentence, Lansky knew that this was more than just a legal defeat. It was a symbolic blow to the empire he had spent his life building. The courtroom, a place Lansky had always avoided like the plague, now became his battleground. His legal team fought to keep him out of prison, but in the end, a 3-month sentence was unavoidable. And while some might consider this a minor setback, for Lansky, it was catastrophic. His reputation had been built on the idea that he was untouchable, that no court, no judge, no law could ever catch him. Yet here he was, reduced to a man pleading for mercy in front of a judge. The fine of $2,500 seemed trivial in comparison to what Lansky had truly lost, the veneer of invincibility. As he stood in that courtroom, Lansky wasn't just reflecting on his own downfall. He was watching the entire underworld shake under the weight of the 1950s. In the sweltering heat of the summer of 1952, Meyer Lansky marked his 50th birthday under a shadow he could not escape, a looming jail sentence, the first of his notorious criminal career. What began as a grand jury investigation into Saratoga's underground gambling scene in the previous year now zeroed in on Lansky. The focus was particularly sharp on the records of the Arrowhead Inn, a glittering gambling den he once co-ran with James Piggy Lynch, an old friend of Joe Adonis. On September 10, 1952, the inevitable happened. Lansky, Lynch, and 5 others were indicted on charges of conspiracy, gambling, and forgery. The forgery charge seemed almost laughable, rooted in a 1947 liquor license application that conveniently omitted Lansky and Lynch's names, opting instead for local Saratoga partners. It was a legal technicality, exaggerated to the level of criminal forgery. But Meyer's lawyer, Moses Polikoff, swiftly cut through the indictment like a hot knife through butter, getting it dismissed before it ever reached a courtroom. Meanwhile, in his plush New York City apartment with a sweeping view of Central Park, Lansky's mind was surely preoccupied by something far grander than mere liquor licenses: Fulgencio Batista's coup in Cuba. As Lansky read the headlines, he saw not just a shift in power, but a lifeline. At the time, Lansky's empire was crumbling under the weight of the Kefauver Committee's crusade against organized crime. His lavish casinos, once bustling with gamblers and money, now stood silent, his empire reduced to ashes. Legal troubles mounted in both New York and Florida, threatening to bury him alive. The committee had branded him as nothing more than a common gangster, an all-around bad citizen, a stinging indictment for someone who had once ruled the gambling world. Batista's return to power in Cuba felt like a glimmer of hope amidst the ruins of Lansky's once dominant empire. But the law didn't let up. In Florida, Lansky dodged disaster, reducing his IRS charges to a slap-on-the-wrist $3,000 fine. Yet on that fateful day, September 10th, he was indicted in New York again. More conspiracy, more gambling, and another charge of forgery, this time tied to the Arrowhead Inn. It was flimsy, more bark than bite, and Polikoff was certain they could win if it went to trial. But Lansky, ever the calculating operator, wasn't willing to roll the dice. He preferred a quiet, behind-the-scenes plea over the sensational headlines of a public trial. He'd take jail if it meant keeping his name out of the papers. And then, in February of 1953, the hammer fell. The man who had been the right-hand strategist to underworld titans like Frank Costello and Lucky Luciano stood before State Supreme Court Justice Leo Haggerty. Meyer Lansky, polished and poised as always, was sentenced to 3 months in Saratoga County Jail and fined $2,500. The charges stem from his clandestine operations at the Arrowhead Inn, a once gilded hotspot for high rollers, now a fallen monument to Saratoga's seedy past. But this wasn't just another indictment. No, this was the result of a 2-year, relentless grand jury investigation hell-bent on ripping open Saratoga's underworld, exposing gambling schemes, backroom deals, and political payoffs, with Lansky's name etched in every line of every scandal. Still, Lansky's troubles were far from over. The United States Attorney General's office had a new target on his back: his very citizenship. The previous December, the announcement had come like a thunderclap. They planned to strip him of his American citizenship, alleging he had concealed his criminal activities when he was naturalized in 1928. Now, the man who had once been untouchable was facing a nightmare he could never have imagined. Not only could he lose his freedom, he could lose the country he had called home for decades. The walls were closing in. Meyer Lansky's lawyer, Moses Polikoff, felt a surge of confidence as he considered the gambling charges. The grand jury testimony barely linked Lansky to the casino floor. His name surfaced only in connection to the Arrowhead Inn's restaurant. "We could have won the case," Polikoff recalled later on in life, but Meyer wasn't willing to gamble on a trial. The man who had spent decades dodging the law feared that a trial would attract unwanted publicity and open the door for testimony that could entangle others in his criminal network. Instead, Lansky chose the safer route. He pleaded guilty. On May 2, 1953, the judge handed him a sentence: a fine of $2,500 and 3 months in Saratoga County Jail. In a final act of defiance, Lansky declined the judge's offer to take a few days to put his affairs in order. Instead, he drove the 8 miles from Ballston Spa into Saratoga Springs for some last-minute shopping, returning that same afternoon with only 2 companions for his prison stint: an English dictionary and a revised version of the King James Bible. As he walked into the county jail, he was far from the glamorous mobster who once commanded an empire of gambling and riches. On May 3rd, the headlines screamed with a shocking revelation. Meyer Lansky, the seemingly untouchable kingpin of the underworld, had been sentenced to prison. It wasn't a life sentence, nor was it lengthy by any stretch, just 3 months behind bars. But for a man like Lansky, known to operate in the shadows with a near-invisible hand, this was a seismic event. The mastermind, who had danced between law and crime with finesse, found himself ensnared, his name now plastered across both local and national newspapers in a scandal that rocked the very core of organized crime. In the year 1953, Lansky, ever the strategist, knew that his days in New York were numbered. He had begun to look south, to Cuba, where he could reinvent himself and regain control. Cuba promised freedom from the constraints of American law and a new frontier for his gambling empire. But even as he plotted his next move, Lansky couldn't shake the feeling that the world was closing in on him. The legal battles, the betrayals, the murders, everything was converging, and Lansky was now a target in a game where the stakes had never been higher. The empire was teetering, and the 1950s were proving to be more dangerous than any decade before. The walls were closing in. This was a new chapter, and Lansky, ever the strategist, knew the next moves would be critical. Cuba beckoned, but the law, relentless as it was, would not stop chasing him. His brief imprisonment was a sign of things to come, a warning that no empire, no matter how cleverly constructed, could last forever under the glaring eyes of justice. The game had changed, and the stakes were higher than ever before. His only cellmate in the quiet jail was Gerard King, a young man from Saratoga Springs who had managed Newman's Lake House, catering to local trade. King and Lansky were assigned neighboring cells, but with no other prisoners around, they were given free rein to roam the block, visiting each other as they pleased. King had never met Lansky before, but soon found himself drawn to the man's intense discipline. Meyer, short and muscular, was a fanatic for exercise, pacing the cell block briskly to maintain his fitness. "We used to do calisthenics together," King recalls. "We'd stand side by side, working our arms up and down." It was clear from Lansky's coaching that he was no stranger to the gym. King remembers him fondly, calling him a gentleman, a man whose word you could trust. Despite being in jail, Lansky maintained a sharp mind. One of their daily pastimes was arithmetic games. King would write down a block of numbers, 7 or 8 digits across, and Meyer, like a human calculator, would run his finger up and down the columns, announcing the totals in seconds. King would check his sums the slow, old-fashioned way, only to find that Lansky was always right. Life in the jail was anything but ordinary. King, being a local, knew the deputies well, and one day, to Lansky's astonishment, the district attorney himself stopped by for a friendly visit with King. "This is Saratoga," King chuckled afterward. "Things are different here." King even arranged for meals to be brought in from local restaurants, turning the selection of the day's menu into an event. Lansky, ever the leader, took charge of their culinary decisions, favoring lamb chops. Twice or 3 times a week, at precisely 10 o'clock, Meyer would make his way to the jail's payphone. His son, Buddy, would be on the other end, ready with the previous night's stock exchange closings from the New York Times. Lansky still had solid stock holdings in companies like Republic Aviation, Eastern Airlines, IT&T, barium steel, and U.S. lines, alongside stakes in Joe Lindsay's horse and dog racing tracks in New England. Even behind bars, Lansky's mind remained tethered to the financial world. His tax returns for 1953 showed him selling off old stock dating back to the mid-1930s, just like his old friend Joe Adonis. This netted Meyer a cool capital gain of $15,300, equivalent to nearly $240,000 in today's money. It was a tidy sum, but also a sign that Meyer was cashing in some of his chips, perhaps sensing that his golden days were beginning to dim. While the furious attention of the Kefauver Committee had failed to pass meaningful legislation, it had shamed several regions into cleaning up their gambling dens. Lansky, ever the survivor, could feel the walls closing in. The king of organized crime was now pacing a jail cell, but his mind, as always, was several steps ahead. By the early 1950s, Meyer Lansky's once thriving gambling operations in Hallandale, Florida, were collapsing under legal pressure. The Bohème and Green Acres clubs, once glittering hotspots of illicit fortune, had shuttered their doors. The Immigration and Naturalization Service, INS, had begun breathing down his neck. In the wake of the Senate Crime Committee's investigations, J. Edgar Hoover lamented that no federal law gave the FBI teeth to pursue mobsters like Lansky, Costello, and Adonis. That's when the INS stepped in. Each man had come to America as an immigrant, and the INS set its sights on deporting them by digging up the murky details of their pasts. Joe Adonis proved to be an easy mark. Though he claimed U.S. citizenship, he had never bothered to get naturalized. Convicted of perjury, Adonis was deported back to Italy in 1954. Meyer Lansky and Frank Costello had been more careful. Both had secured their U.S. citizenship, but neither had disclosed their criminal records when they did so. The penalty for this was deportation. In the aftermath of the Kefauver hearings, INS agents like Benjamin Edelstein were dispatched to compile dossiers on both men. Edelstein's investigation into Lansky was relentless, and his primary witness was the unreliable Daniel Ahern, a lifelong jailbird who was all too eager to dredge up stories about Meyer. Ahern gleefully recounted Lansky's involvement in brutal attacks, including the infamous lead pipe beating of a foreman from Peekskill and the shooting of John Barrett, followed by a failed attempt to poison Barrett in the hospital with tainted chicken. Ahern's testimony alone wouldn't hold water, but Edelstein wasn't finished. He tracked down Barrett himself, as well as Detective Heinrich, who had taken Barrett's initial testimony. Heinrich had filed attempted murder charges, but Barrett had later refused to testify, likely intimidated into silence by Lansky. Edelstein also dug up Benny Siegel's widow, Esther, who remembered Meyer standing beside her at her wedding, and even Lansky's first wife, Anne, who revealed that Meyer had lied about his occupation when applying for citizenship. He had claimed to be a tool-and-die machinist, a complete fabrication to mask his true criminal pursuits. Although Anne wasn't a strong witness, she conducted her entire interview with Edelstein in complete darkness, prompting him to describe her as very peculiar. It was still a damning indication that Lansky had concealed his past. By the time Meyer was serving his brief stint in the Saratoga County Jail in 1953, cut short by a month for good behavior, the Naturalization Service had yet to file formal charges, but he knew they were on his trail. Edelstein had even tracked down Irving Tabo Sandler, a former associate, and Tabo wasted no time in contacting Lansky's family to tip them off about the INS's investigation. Lansky's time with his King James Bible and quiet cellmate in Ballston Spa might soon seem like a walk in the park compared to the storm that was brewing. If the INS managed to strip him of his citizenship, Meyer Lansky, the feared and powerful kingpin of organized crime, would face not just the loss of his freedom, but the terrifying prospect of being cast out of the only country he had called home since his youth. Meyer Lansky wasn't the only one facing the storm of deportation. Just 1 year later, in 1954, Joe Adonis would be forced out of the country, leaving Frank Costello exposed and vulnerable. The balance of power was on a knife's edge, with only Anastasia trying to maintain some control, but even his grip was slipping. The entire landscape was unstable, with Vito Genovese not only battling a messy divorce, but also facing his own deportation issues. In fact, it wasn't just Genovese. Carlos Marcello was in the crosshairs too. The Immigration and Naturalization Service, INS, had launched an all-out war, and they were winning. Not only had they already deported Silver Dollar Sam, but they were starting to clear out a backlog of dangerous gangsters, and it wasn't just the Italians. Irish, English, French, and others were feeling the heat. The INS had made incredible strides, systematically rooting out mobsters across the board. As the 1950s rolled on, the IRS got involved, digging deep into the files of organized crime figures to uncover who had lied on immigration forms or skipped the process entirely. Amid all this chaos, one name stood out: Carlos Marcello. The war between the Immigration Department and Marcello escalated, reaching a boiling point in 1961 with his illegal kidnapping, orchestrated by none other than Robert F. Kennedy. The stakes were higher than ever, and no one was safe. Gerard King Meyer's cellmate noticed that, at times, Meyer Lansky would fall into deep contemplation, lost in memories of a past that seemed worlds away from their current surroundings. He used to tell me about his grandfather back in Russia. What a wonderful man he was, King recalled. Lansky even confided in King a desire that seemed strikingly premature for a man just past 50. He said he wanted to be buried in Israel, in Jerusalem, like his grandfather, King remembered, revealing a softer, almost vulnerable side of the notorious gangster. While Lansky served his time, his wife Teddy stayed in New York, caring for their 15-year-old daughter, Sandra. Meyer's attempts to hide his remarriage from his children had backfired spectacularly. Paul, his son, had found out through a classmate and had been consumed by rage, calling his father to confront him. Sandra's response was quieter, but no less damaging. She had been just 9 years old when her parents divorced, too young to grasp the full extent of her father's deceptions. All she knew was that her father had lied, and it felt like a betrayal. Her simmering anger was directed at Teddy, the other woman. Unlike her brother, Sandra didn't act out anger. She simply withdrew. Her school performance suffered, and she became self-absorbed, focusing more on her appearance than her studies. By 14, she had asked her father for a nose job, a request Meyer had refused, despite rarely denying his daughter anything. Yet, with Meyer locked away, Teddy seized the opportunity and secretly arranged the surgery behind his back. The Kefauver hearings had already frayed the Lansky family's fragile relationships, and the constant presence of reporters didn't help. Journalists loitered around their building, pestering the children for quotes, hoping to get that human angle on the crime saga. Buddy Lansky, ever his father's son, had been coached by Meyer on how to handle law enforcement. "Don't answer them," Meyer instructed. "Tell them you need to see your lawyer first. And don't lie. You tell one lie, and you'll need another to cover it up." Buddy took his father's advice seriously, though it also gave him a sense of importance, as if he were guarding some great secret, though he wasn't quite sure what that secret was. On one occasion, staying at his mother's apartment, Buddy spotted 2 men in hats watching from the street. Panic seized him. Believing they were law enforcement, he flushed a list of phone numbers down the toilet, the numbers of his girlfriends, all prostitutes. To his relief, the men turned out not to be after him, but the paranoia lingered. There was, however, an odd perk to the Kefauver hearings. Buddy found it easier to get good seats in restaurants and Broadway shows. The name Lansky now commanded a strange new respect among the city's nightlife elite. While his brother Paul despised the newfound notoriety, Buddy and Sandra basked in it, walking with a little extra swagger. But this only deepened the rifts within the family. Then there was Teddy's son, Richard Schwartz, a brash, barrel-chested young man who had been indulged by his own parents much like the Lansky children. Buddy first discovered he had a stepbrother when his friend Vinnie Mercurio returned to their apartment one day to report that Buddy's car had been taken from the garage. "The attendant says that Mr. Lansky's son has taken it," Vinnie relayed. Confused, Buddy checked with his father, only to be met with an offhand response. "Oh, I forgot to tell you. Teddy has a son." Richard soon became a thorn in the side of Meyer's children, especially Buddy, who found him loud, pushy, and really Jewish, as he put it. A comment that revealed Buddy's distaste for the brashness he associated with his stepbrother. Richard frequently passed himself off as Meyer Lansky's son around New York, much to the irritation of Meyer's real children. Amid this family turmoil, Buddy was leading a secret life of his own, one filled with prostitutes and late-night escapades. Not even his best friend, Vinnie, knew why Buddy would sometimes vanish without a word. Buddy didn't just pay for sex. He cultivated relationships with the women, treating them to dinners and attempting to build a bizarre sense of companionship. His father's financial support, along with his earnings from a ticket agency, allowed him to maintain this double life. But it all backfired when one of his girlfriends, pregnant by another man, stole a valuable ring from her pimp in desperation. The pimp, in turn, came after Buddy for the money. Fearing for his safety, Buddy turned to his drinking buddies, who managed to scare the pimp off. But the incident didn't escape Meyer's attention, and when he found out, he was livid. For a man who had spent his life mastering control over vast criminal enterprises, this episode was a painful reminder of how easily things could spiral out of control, even within his own family. The Lansky household, once held together by Meyer's sheer force of will, was now on the verge of unraveling. His children were lost in their own worlds, Paul in his anger, Sandra in her insecurities, Buddy in his secret life, and Meyer, the patriarch, was fighting battles on all fronts. From the INS investigation threatening to strip him of his citizenship to the mounting tensions at home, it was clear that the golden years of Lansky's empire were long gone, replaced by a grim, uncertain future. Meyer Lansky had always held high hopes for his elder son, Buddy, despite the challenges Buddy faced due to his disability. Meyer once joked, "For a young fellow with a disability, you sure know how to get into trouble." Buddy's job at the ticket agency in New York had led him into bad company, and Meyer decided it was time for a change of scenery. He believed Buddy had the sharp mind needed to rise above his physical limitations, and he envisioned his son one day managing his own business. So, Meyer sent Buddy down to Florida for a fresh start. In 1951, Meyer had managed to transfer what capital he could from his defunct gambling operations in Broward County into a legitimate business venture. A small motel development called Plantation Harbor, located in the Florida Keys, 60 miles south of Miami. The motel, a cluster of bungalows overlooking the Gulf of Mexico, was as far removed from Meyer's gambling empire as one could imagine. With its modest breakwater providing safe anchorage for small boats, Plantation Harbor was a declared investment meant to give Meyer a legitimate income, and hopefully some peace of mind with the IRS. He sent Buddy there in hopes that running the motel would keep him out of trouble, and perhaps even spark an interest in the hospitality business. Buddy spent most of the year at Plantation Harbor, but it wasn't the fresh start Meyer had hoped for. Buddy didn't show much interest in learning the motel business. The swamps around the motel were full of dangerous wildlife, including water moccasins and the occasional rattlesnake, which kept Buddy confined to his bungalow after dark. It was a quiet, solitary existence, far from the troubles he had encountered in New York, but also far from any meaningful progress. Meanwhile, Buddy's younger brother Paul was thriving. In 1950, Paul achieved his long-held ambition of gaining entrance to West Point, with plans to become an Air Force officer. Though the New York press and Senator Kefauver tried to cast suspicion on Paul's successful application, suggesting that it was helped along by Congressman Arthur G. Klein, a guest at one of Frank Costello's infamous dinners, this was misleading. West Point admissions required candidates without military connections to secure a nomination from a congressman, senator, or the vice president. Paul had earned his place at West Point on his own merit, and Meyer was immensely proud of his son's accomplishment. Meyer's pride in Paul became a rare bright spot in his otherwise turbulent life. He would make the drive up the Hudson Valley to visit his son at the United States Military Academy, taking along the rest of the family, his mother Yetta, his sister Esther, and even his ex-wife Anne, in a spirit of shared pride. Picnics at West Point, watching Paul march in full-dress uniform during parades, became cherished moments for Meyer. He boasted to his friends about his son's achievements, and when Paul visited him in jail at Ballston Spa, Meyer made sure that everyone around knew that his clever son was a West Point cadet. These visits were a much-needed consolation during a particularly dark period in Meyer's life. The early 1950s were undeniably tough for Lansky. He had been publicly vilified as a national pariah during the Kefauver hearings, fined in Florida, jailed in Saratoga, and his once lucrative gambling enterprises had been shut down. His future prospects for making a legal living seemed bleak. In the midst of all this, West Point was a rare source of pride and solace, a tangible symbol of success in a country that now sought to tear him down. As Meyer stood among the crowds at West Point, watching Paul in his dress uniform, with the cadet bands playing and white caps flying through the air, he could find comfort in the thought that, at least in this respect, he had succeeded in America. While Meyer wrestled with his own challenges, his brother Jake Lansky was living a more settled, family-oriented life. By 1950, 45-year-old Jake had distanced himself from the notoriety that Meyer faced. He and his wife, Anna, lived in a comfortable stucco home on Harrison Street, in one of the more pleasant and respectable neighborhoods of Hollywood, Florida. The quiet streets were lined with broad, well-kept homes, shaded by pines and palm trees. Jake and Anna focused on raising their two daughters, Roberta, Ricky, and Linda, who attended the prestigious Pinecrest School in Fort Lauderdale. Despite the sudden attention brought on by the Kefauver Committee's investigation, the Lanskys lived modestly and avoided drawing attention to themselves. Jake, unlike Meyer, had managed to carve out a peaceful and unobtrusive existence for his family. While Meyer faced the weight of legal battles, public scrutiny, and the potential loss of everything he had built, Jake's life in Florida seemed like a quiet, familial retreat. Yet, even as the two brothers lived different lives, the shadow of their shared past loomed ever-present, threatening to catch up with them both in due time. Life for Jake Lansky and his family changed dramatically when his name began to surface frequently in the testimony during the Kefauver hearings. While Jake hadn't been subpoenaed to appear before the committee, he was constantly mentioned as Meyer's partner, manager, and frontman, running the Colonial Inn and representing the Lansky interests in ventures like Frank Costello's slot machine business. When Meyer was indicted in September 1950 for gambling violations in Florida, Jake was dragged into the mess too, receiving a $2,000 fine. For the Lanskys, living in the small, close-knit community of Hollywood, Florida, any scandal was hard to escape. Jeannie Henry, a friend of Jake's younger daughter, Linda, remembers how some parents began telling their children to distance themselves from the Lansky girls after the newspaper reports. But Jeannie's father, Robert Henry, a self-made builder, thought this was absurd. Despite not knowing Linda's parents personally, he believed Linda was a good friend for his daughter. When Anna Lansky came by one evening to thank him for not keeping Jeannie away from Linda, Robert brushed it off with a smile. "Jeannie is not a fair-weather friend," he said. For Jeannie, who was just entering 7th grade at the time, none of it seemed to matter much. To her, Linda's home life seemed like the ideal of what a home should be. She preferred spending time at the Lansky house rather than her own, often running the short distance between their homes via a back alley. Sleepovers were almost always at Linda's house, where everything seemed just a bit more elegant. The Lanskys lived with a certain understated grace. Dinners at a long table, adorned with fine china, crystal and silver, without a ketchup bottle in sight. 2 maids, Ruth and Louise, handled the household chores, and when Mrs. Lansky rang the bell beside her seat at the dinner table, the maids would clear the dishes and bring out the next course. Yet, for all this refinement, the Lansky household didn't feel stuffy or distant. It was warm, structured and disciplined in a way that Jeannie admired. Jake was a kind and affectionate husband. Jeannie never saw him raise his voice to Anna, and if they had disagreements, they handled them privately. She remembers Jake as a genial figure, always calm and considerate. He took pride in his role as the head of the family, whether at home or on their weekly outings to neighborhood restaurants like Joe Sonken's Gold Coast. On these family dinners, Jake made sure to include Linda's friend Jeannie, making her feel as much a part of the family as anyone else. When Ruth and Louise needed to stay late, Jake, ever the thoughtful host, would personally drive them home to avoid trouble with the police, who might stop black residents in the white sections of town after dark. Meyer Lansky, known to the family as Uncle Meyer, would visit frequently, though often without his wife Teddy, who everyone found to be somewhat difficult. Cousin Sandra, Meyer's daughter, was also challenging to get along with, while Paul, the golden child, was mostly absent, off at West Point. Buddy Lansky, despite his physical challenges, was a cheerful and frequent visitor. Whenever he came to town, he was welcomed with warmth and lively conversation. Looking back, Dr. Jean Henry, as she would later become, can now piece together the other side of the Lansky family's life, the one that wasn't so obvious to a young girl. Figures like Joe Adonis would occasionally drop by in the early days. Mr. Alo, a close associate of Meyer's, lived just around the corner in a white house on Monroe Street, with a view over South Lake, where manatees could still be spotted from time to time. Alo's niece, Carol, would sometimes join Jeannie and Linda in their play. There were moments of innocent excitement, like the time Linda discovered wooden cigar boxes filled with dollar bills and a large black gun in her parents' closet. She called Jeannie over, and together they marveled at the find. But the next time they peeked into the closet, the money and the gun were gone. These glimpses into the darker side of Lansky's world were fleeting for the girls, who mostly occupied themselves with more mundane concerns. Jake was often away on business, traveling to Las Vegas to keep an eye on Meyer's interests in the Flamingo, which was now under the profitable management of Gus Greenbaum, Davy Berman, and their Las Vegas partners. Jake also collected dividends on the $190,000 cash investment he and Meyer had put into their more recent venture, the Thunderbird Hotel Casino. Despite the whispers, the fines, and the scandal surrounding the Kefauver hearings, the Lansky family in Hollywood maintained a semblance of normalcy. They lived quietly, modestly, and with grace, trying to shield themselves from the relentless scrutiny of the world outside. But for those close enough to see the inner workings, it was clear that the weight of Meyer's legacy was always looming, even in the sun-drenched streets of Hollywood, Florida. In the early 1950s, Jake Lansky played a pivotal role in the family's business dealings, though his contributions were often overshadowed by his older brother, Meyer. One such instance involved the opening of the Thunderbird Casino in Las Vegas. Marion Hicks, the principal owner, found himself short on bankroll when the casino first opened, and Jake stepped in. Lending the necessary funds through George Sadlow, a Texas gambler, to help keep the operation afloat. The cash that Linda Lansky and Jeannie Henry discovered in Jake's closet likely came from the skim operations at either the Flamingo or the Thunderbird, as by then the Kefauver Committee had shut down many of the Lansky family's gambling ventures. Jean Henry, now a respected doctor, disputes any notion that Jake was just the stupid younger brother. In her view, Jake was the backbone of the Lansky family, solid, loyal, and far more intelligent than people gave him credit for. She compares him to Bobby Kennedy, the steadfast supporter of his more famous brother JFK. For Jan, her memories of Jake and Anna Lansky are filled with simple joys, far removed from the world of gangsters. She recalls the sunny years beneath Hollywood's pine trees and palms, feeding bread to manatees, floating boats in storm drains, and running down the alley to the Lansky home, which was a model of warmth, structure, and kindness. I knew them as gentle, kind, loving people, she says, who were really good to their family, and to me, a strange little girl from down the street. By the autumn of 1953, after Meyer had completed his jail sentence and Buddy had returned from his quiet exile in the Florida Keys, the Lansky family's internal tensions began to surface more dramatically. Sandra Lansky, barely 16, confided in her older brother Buddy that she wanted to marry Marvin Rappaport, a handsome young man she had met at the New York Horse Show. Buddy was taken aback. "Sandra, you're too young," he told her. But Sandra was undeterred. "What have I got?" she asked. "A broken home? A stepmother I can't get along with?" Sandra had grown into a rebellious and headstrong teenager. She had been virtually unsupervised since the age of 10 and was given a generous weekly allowance by Meyer. Her defiance frustrated her father, especially her poor progress in school. When Sandra expressed her desire to marry Marvin at just 15, Meyer was infuriated. He was certain that marriage would put an end to any chance of her finishing high school or going to college. Buddy, unsure of how to help, suggested Sandra talk to their family doctor, Dr. Harris, who was respected for his wisdom and discretion. Dr. Harris acted as a mediator, speaking with both Sandra and Meyer. After Sandra's 16th birthday in early 1954, Meyer relented, telling Buddy, "We've got it all straightened out. She's going to get engaged in June, finish high school, and then get married." Sandra excitedly relayed the same news to her brother, but confusion still reigned in the Lansky household. Teddy Lansky pointed out the discrepancies in the stories. "You tell one thing, and she tells another," Teddy told Meyer. Ultimately, it was Marvin's family, the Rappaports, who brought some clarity to the situation. Both families were struggling to manage their difficult children and concluded that allowing the young couple to marry sooner rather than later might be the best solution. Buddy met his future brother-in-law for the first time on the morning of the wedding and immediately sensed the tension. "The guy was queer up and down," Buddy later recalled, using the derogatory language of the time. "Nice fellow, but a queer." Despite his misgivings, the wedding proceeded. On the day of the wedding, Buddy was shocked when he returned from the barber to find Sandra with her hair bleached stark white. "You look like a damn fool," he told her bluntly. He wasn't wrong. When Meyer saw his daughter's transformed appearance, he was furious. "For 2 cents, I'd call off this wedding," Meyer growled. It was only the intervention of their Aunt Esther that diffused the situation. "Leave them alone," she firmly told Meyer. "It's not your wedding." In the end, Meyer had no choice but to swallow his anger and sit down with Sandra for a serious talk. He may have been a patriarch in control of a sprawling criminal empire, but when it came to his children, especially his rebellious daughter, even Meyer Lansky found himself humbled. The family, always a complex tangle of emotions and business, tried to move forward as best they could, navigating the tensions that seemed to arise at every turn. 2 years after Sandra Lansky's short-lived marriage to Marvin Rappaport ended in collapse, Meyer Lansky and Buddy were returning from a visit with Sandra and her infant son, Meyer's first grandchild. As they drove in silence, something weighed heavily on Meyer's mind. After a long pause, he turned to Buddy and cautiously asked, "Do you notice anything funny about Marvin?" Buddy, slightly incredulous, replied, "It took you this long to figure it out?" Meyer, looking thoughtful, responded, "Well, you could have told me." Despite his sharp mind and control over his vast criminal empire, even Meyer hadn't seen the red flags in Sandra's ill-fated marriage until it was too late. While Sandra's marriage had fallen apart, Meyer found some solace in his younger son Paul, who seemed to embody the hopes Meyer had once had for his children. Paul, just over a year out of West Point, was stationed as a pilot at McCord Air Base in Washington State, overlooking the picturesque Puget Sound. It was there, in the autumn of 1955, that Paul met Edna Shook, a striking, determined woman who was 6 years older than him and had already been married once before. Despite their age difference, the two quickly fell in love and planned to marry the following year. When Meyer arrived in Tacoma for the wedding, he made a strong impression on Edna. She admired his quiet dignity and the air of authority he carried. He didn't speak often, but when he did, it was on serious subjects like politics, and his presence seemed to command respect. Meyer also appeared quite wealthy, staying in the Winthrop Hotel, one of the best in Tacoma. Paul had been evasive about his father's line of work, leading Edna to assume Meyer was involved in some kind of high-level government job that wasn't discussed openly. She liked her father-in-law and sensed that the feeling was mutual. After all the chaos with Buddy and Sandra, Meyer seemed relieved that one of his children had found a strong and sensible partner in Edna. The wedding was to be a small, intimate military ceremony at the chapel in Fort Lewis, with Meyer, Teddy, and Sandra representing the Lansky family. Buddy, unfortunately, couldn't attend because his disability made flying such a long distance difficult. Sandra had recently separated from Marvin and made the trip to Tacoma, but her focus was elsewhere. As soon as she arrived, she was on the phone, making lengthy calls back to New York to instruct the maid to care for her baby, Gary. Edna found it impressive that anyone could spend so many minutes talking about something as mundane as fresh orange juice. However, Lansky's representation at the wedding unexpectedly shrank from 3 to 2 on the day of the event. Sandra, barely 19, decided to fly back to New York for a more pressing engagement, a last-minute New Year's Eve date. Despite Meyer's urging that she stay in Tacoma for just one more day to fulfill her family duty, Sandra chose to leave, frustrating her father. Reflecting on this later, Buddy summed up the paradox of his father's life. "It's the most amazing thing. Here's a man who could control men, but he couldn't control his kids." Despite all of Meyer Lansky's power and influence, when it came to his children, even he found himself at a loss, unable to shape their paths or prevent their rebellious choices.